when you develop a simulation model, if the model is actually going to present you with an accurate implication of the interactions, it's appropriate that the time settings are set up correctly. So I want to spend a few minutes and talk about different things regarding time settings, and I'm going to use the two most simplest systems archetypes, the reinforcing loop and the balancing loop, to go ahead and talk through several aspects of this. So the reinforcing loop is just a stock, and for a savings account is a stock, an interest rate, and periodically interest is calculated and added to the principal. So this is in fact a reinforcing or growth structure. And in this particular situation, the principal is initially established at $100. The interest rate is 5%, which I know is a little high for the current state of things, but hopefully it'll get better. And the time settings are set up so that I want to start at 0, and I want to simulate over a period of 10 years, and I want a time step of 1, which essentially means each year. So it will go from 0 to year 1 to year 2. And there are two options that people have for selecting the analysis algorithm. Euler, which is the quicker approach, which turns out to be correct for most of the simulations. The alternative is RK4, which is a more detailed estimation of the values between the time steps, though over 90% of the time Euler turns out to be just fine. So now that those time steps or the time settings are set up, I'll go ahead and run the simulation for the savings account. And over a period of 10 years, the principal in the savings account started at 100 and ends up at about 162 point whatever. And here is a table of those same values so that you can see the specific values at the different time settings. So that at the end of each time period being 1, the interest is added to the principal and then used to calculate the interest for the next period. Though in most instances, for savings accounts anyway, the principal isn't, or the interest isn't computed annually. It's usually done maybe quarterly. So if I change the time step to 0.25, which means 4 times a year, and run the same simulation over again, we find out that it actually doesn't change the value very much, even though it's done quarterly over a period of 10 years. And the reason for that is that the interest rate is 5%, meaning that it's a relatively small periodic contribution to the value. To really see the difference, if we change this and say the principal is 1 and the interest rate is 1, and this is just for demonstration purposes, this isn't very relevant to a savings account, and I say that I start at 0 and have a simulation length of 10 and use a time step of 1. When I now run this simulation, the principal starts at 0 and ends at 1024, which is obviously just 2 to the 10th. It's pretty obvious. And you notice the choppy nature of this in that it's adding a significant amount, or it's changing a significant amount from one time period to the next, and actually changing the slope. And the table shows that it's doubling every time period. In this instance, if we now go ahead and change the time settings and in fact compound it every half a year and run this again, notice that now the resultant value is more like 3,000. So it's significantly more than it was here. This one ends up being at 3,300 and this one is at 1,024. So that while the compounding has an impact, the extent of that impact depends upon what the percentage contribution is that's being added each one of those periods. If it's adding a very, very little amount each period, then having the period doesn't change much at all. So when you develop a simulation model, you generally have a sense of the time period or the time frame of the things, the activity of things in your model, so that you generally know whether or not you want to run the model in seconds or minutes or hours or days. And then the determination of the time step needs to be small enough so that it's not likely that there are any interactions that are missed between the time steps. And oftentimes one has to simply go ahead and run the simulation, cut the time step in half and run it again to see if there is a significant difference between the answers. If there isn't, then your time step is probably small enough, and you can probably go ahead and multiply it back or multiply it by 2 to get back to the larger value. And we typically use time steps which are subdivisions of 1 divided by 2, so that it's either 1 or 0.5 or 0.25 or 0.025, as opposed to using tenths. It turns out that using these multiples is more appropriate than using tenths and hundredths and thousandths. Now, if I go ahead and do some of the same kinds of simulations with regard to the balancing loop, where there's a goal, a current state, and the difference between those two is the basis for action to change the current state. And in this model, there's a factor here which is simply varies from 0 to 100% to indicate the extent to which that difference actually results in action to change the current state. The factor is pretty much akin to the interest in the savings account model. So in this one, we'll start with a goal of 100, a factor of 1, and the settings are still the same, starting at 1, varying to 10 on a time step of 1. When I run this and look at the balance, notice that this goes from 0 and reaches the goal in 1 time step, which in most instances is probably inappropriate or simply not realistic, because whatever is responsible for this action probably takes longer than that to actually operate. So if we in fact cut this to 0.5 and run it again, it begins to look a little bit more realistic in terms of the period of time that it takes for the current state to migrate towards the goal of the balancing loop. And as I then, well, if you look at this, you can notice that this is rather choppy in terms of the way that it transitions. So if I change this to actually calculate the values every half of a year and run this again, you'll notice that it does in fact get much smoother in terms of the transition. So if I look at the table for this, we see that it starts out with a goal of 100, and the difference between them is 100, but I'm doing it, but there's a factor of 0.5 applied, so the action is only 50. It takes half of that at the 0.5 interval and adds it, takes the difference, and continues along that lines until it gets to the end, and it has come pretty close to reaching the goal that was in fact specified. So just be careful when you, be mindful when you set up the time settings. You don't want the time step really small, because then it takes a long time for the simulation to run. And you don't want it too large, because then the answer that it shows you is likely to be not really representative of the interactions that you've actually designed into the model. So oftentimes it takes a number of iterations back and forth to determine what the appropriate settings are. So this model is online, and you can go ahead and play with it and as you do, you will get a better sense of, or a better feel for the way that the time settings interplay with the interactions to give you a sense of the implications as a result. So, hope you found this informative. See you in the next video.